Okay, before I start, a couple of words of warning. I'm a scientist by training, which means I like data and I like graphs. So I've done a quick graph. This is the level of audience pain against the number of slides given in a 45-minute presentation. I reckon there's a safe limit of about 90. Now, being a scientist, I like to experiment, so I'll be using no less than 215. I know what you're probably thinking. Let's run out of the room now. What the fiddlesticks is happening here. But don't worry, because I'm going to start off with giving you a map of our presentation. I'm going to start by talking about the issue of strategy in organizations, and then we're heading south for the rest of the presentation. We'll talk about situational awareness, what it is, why it matters, the importance of maps. We'll talk about patterns of change, and if we've got enough time, we've got a bit of a magical mystery tour at the end. So I'm going to start with the issue of strategy. It's quite a personal subject to me. So back in 2004, I was working for this company, online photo service called Fatango. Had about 16 different lines of business, millions of users, but it had a problem. And the problem was the CEO. The CEO was an imposter. I know that because I was the CEO. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. We were making revenue, we were very profitable, it was growing, but rather than being the sort of chess-playing master that you hear about in HBR, I was the alchemist. I was making it up as I went along. Now, we had things like this. This is Fatango's vision statement in 2003. Our strategy is customer-focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. We'd adopted XP, Extreme Programming, around 2000. But the problem with this is I just copied it from other companies. So I was worried that people would eventually rumble that I didn't know what I was doing. So I used to go around recording other CEOs talking about strategy. I would record the short words they would say, the frequently used words, which I call business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And I do this every couple of years. This is 2014. These are the common BLAs: digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if I did it today, you'd probably, AI, a bit of IoT. You've got to have a bit of blockchain in there, so you'd put a bit of blockchain in there. And I took all these company strategy documents and I combined them together and generated what I called a BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I combined the BLAs and the BLA templates and also generated 64 different strategies at random. Things like this. Our strategy is customer focus. We will lead a disruptive effort of the market through our use of innovative social media and big data to build a collaborative cloud-based ecosystem. Remember, it's total gibberish. This is number 2. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage. I can barely say the words. Anyway, so I sent these around and I got 400 responses of 3 types. Number 1, this is the exact wording from our business plan. Number 2 was I've seen 2 of these used already. And number 3, my favourite, was are you for hire? So a friend of mine has put this all online. This is strategy as a service. So if you ever need a strategy, you just type in the URL and it will automatically generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. So this is from a couple of days ago. Our strategy is collaborative. And if you don't like it, it's really simple. You just press refresh and that's it. So about 2004, I started to suspect anyway that I might not be the only person who was an imposter, who was faking it. So I went back to first principles, started off with Sun Tzu. Anybody know what Sun Tzu wrote? Art of war. Fantastic. So we talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. 1, understand your purpose, your moral imperative. 2, understand the landscape you're competing in. Then 3, understand the climatic patterns which are impacting the landscape, so how it's changing. Then you get into organizational structure, so doctrine, how the principles you use to organize yourself around something. And finally, you get into the leadership bit, the context-specific play stuff. Then I came across a chap called John Boyd, US Air Force pilot. Anybody know what he wrote? OODA loops. So you have the game, that's your purpose. The first thing you need to do is observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. Then you orientate yourself with doctrine. Then you decide where you're going to attack and you act. I was quite excited by this. So I would show it to other people. And they would tell me, it doesn't matter. Strategy is all about the importance of why. Well, the thing is, there's 2 whys. There's the why of purpose, as in what I want to achieve, and there is the why of movement, as in why do I make this decision over that? And they are fundamentally different things. So if you think about a game of chess, your why of purpose might be to win the game. Your why of movement is, should I move this piece or that piece? And of course, you move this piece, the pawn, you gain a slight positional advantage. You move this piece, it's checkmate. So it's through the action of movement that we actually learn about the environment. So there I was with for Tango. I thought, right, can I sort of apply this? So we sort of had a purpose, being an online photo service, along with the 15 other lines of business. The next question I had was, how do we observe the landscape? How do we understand the environment that we're operating in? And this brings me to the topic of situational awareness. And the best way of explaining this is with 3 examples, Vikings, chess, and Themistocles. So Vikings, very frightening people. This is how they used to navigate. From Herman, head due west towards Half, and you will have sailed north of Hatland, so that you glimpse it. They use stories. Now that is what that story means. So quick question for all of you. What would you use to navigate? A visual map or a verbal story? Matt? Right, what do we use in business? Stories. Okay. Next one, chess world. I want you to imagine you live in a world where everybody plays chess, but no one's ever seen the board. You play the game very simply. You have the pieces. You press a button like pawn. Your opponent sees what you've pressed. They counter pawn. You counter pawn. They counter queen. And the game goes on for ages until somebody wins, or more likely it's a draw. Now what will happen is after many games, we will start to find magic secrets of success within the sequences. So if you press queen, I should respond with knight and rook. And we'll write articles about that. If you don't believe me that we do this in business, this is Harvard Business Review, November 2011, how earlobes can signify leadership potential. So what matters for your CEO is how big his or her earlobes are. So one day you're going to play a game of chess against somebody who will see the board. And it's going to be very simple. You're going to move, they're going to counter. You're going to move, they're going to counter, and you'll have lost. Now your first reaction will be to copy the sequence down, because you can't see the board. So you think this is a magic secret of success. You will use that sequence and you will lose. You've got all your big data systems, all your sequences, but you will lose against this player who's been playing for a few days. So the next thing is you'll start to question whether it's the speed at which they press the button. So you'll start recording that, and you'll lose. Now you'll start going, maybe it's cultural. Maybe they're a happy sort of person. And you will lose. You will lose because you exist in a low-level situational awareness environment. So what would you use to learn? Secrets of success or context-specific forms of gameplay as described by a board? Great, context-specific play. What do we use in business? Secrets, bit of muttering, don't want to admit. Okay, next one. Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. What he decided to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians into a coastal road known as Thermopylae, narrow pass where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. Now, there were about 170,000 Persians, 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. Right. So I want you to imagine you're part of the Athenian army, so part of the Greek states. It's the eve of battle. Themistocles is giving you purpose, a moral imperative. We want to defend against the invading Persian horde. But he says to you, I don't actually understand the landscape. I don't understand the environment. I don't have a map, but have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. Strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we actually hate the Spartans. And the threats: the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. Okay. So what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map, or would you use some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram? What would you use? What do you use in business? Okay, so if I go back to chess and alchemy, and I look at navigation, learning, and strategy, then chess is all visual, it's context-specific. Learning is all about, learning is context-specific. Strategy is all about position and movement. It's what we call a high-level situational awareness environment. It's a bit like the military. If you ask a general, why did you bomb that hill? They won't say, because I read an article in General Weekly that bombing hills was the latest thing. Or that I got some consultant report saying 67% of other generals are bombing hills. Or that I thought it would make a good story. It's all about position and movement. Now, alchemy is all about storytelling, secrets of success, and magic frameworks. It's a low-level situational awareness environment, and that's where I was back in 2004, 2005. But I would explain this to people and they'd say, we're successful. Well, I was successful. But the thing is, business is a catfight. And it's okay to be utterly blind to the environment that you're competing in as long as everybody else is. There's a wonderful study by Marcus Pfizer which looks at variance decomposition impact of CEO effects. And what it determines is 70% of CEOs have no impact beyond random chance. I.e., you could just replace them with anybody off the street and it wouldn't make a difference to the organization. It's not a very popular study. So I would say this to people and they would go, but we're not stupid. I'm not saying people are. I'm saying understand the difference. The difference is the existence of maps. Now, what makes a map? Well, maps have certain characteristics which make them very useful for learning and for collaboration. One, they're visual. Two, they're context-specific. It's the battle at hand. Three, you have the position of pieces relative to some sort of anchor. In geographical maps, the anchor is the compass. And so you have consistency of movement. If I want to go from Athens to Thebes, which direction would I go? Northwest. It's not going to suddenly one day you're going to wake up and it's south. There's consistent. And I would say this to people and they would say, but we have maps. Well, that's what I thought. I had things like this, systems maps. Have you ever seen one of these? Yeah? Right. So I'm going to take something like CRM, customer relationship management, and I'm going to shift it over there. How has that changed the meaning of this map? It hasn't. If I took a geographical map and I shifted, say, Australia and put it next to, say, I don't know, next to the UK, for example, would that change the meaning of that map? Yes. Well, the problem with this map, it's not actually a map. But it's okay, I had business process maps. Except for they're not maps either. Then we had things like digital road maps, not like this horror, which has recently appeared. They're not maps either. And then we had mind maps, and it turns out they're not maps either. In fact, we kept on using that word, and it didn't mean what we actually thought it meant. So how do you map an environment? So this is the problem that I was faced with. So I sat down, being a Brit, and I had a cup of tea. And while I was having a cup of tea, I realized, as a user, I had a need for a cup of tea. And a cup of tea has needs. It needs hot water, it needs tea. And hot water has needs. It needs water, it needs a kettle. And a kettle has needs. It needs power. So what I've got is an anchor, the user, and I've got position in a value chain relative to that user. So I was able to take a systems diagram and go, right, customer, we'll put them at the top, and then we'll position all the components underneath it in a chain of needs. Now, I'm partially there, but I'm missing movement. I have to somehow describe movement in a map. So I took one bit, power, and looked at the history of power, starting with arguably the Parthian battery, 400 AD, all the way to Tesla Westinghouse, utility provision of electricity, 1886. Now, evolution is change, is movement. And after spending about 6 months collecting 9,000 odd data points in the British Library, I managed to generate this graph. What you've got is the ubiquity of something versus certainty. And you start off with the genesis of novel and new acts, rare and poorly understood. Then you get custom-built examples, and then products, then rental services, and then eventually commodity and utility services. It's all driven by demand and supply competition. So what I was able to do was take my value chain, flatten the evolution curve at the bottom, genesis, custom-built, product, commodity, and then simply put things where they were, and now I had a map. And that was the first map I produced in 2005. You've got the anchor at the top, you've got position relative to the anchor, and you've got movement. And so I showed it to others, and they went, so what? Well, now we get into patterns. The point about being able to see a landscape is once you can see a landscape, like a chessboard, which has position, anchor, and movement, you can start to learn patterns of play. And the first set of patterns you learn are climactic. So these are the rules that influence the game. The first rule you learn is that everything evolves. Doesn't matter what it is. If there's supply and demand competition, it all starts over here, and eventually it ends up over here. The next thing you learn is characteristics change. So in this genesis space, it's all chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable. Ear be dragons. You have to gamble. Eventually, it doesn't matter whether it's money, computing, or penicillin, it transitions through a set of characteristics in the middle and eventually becomes industrialized, ordered, standard, boring, dull. Now, that had a big impact on me. And the reason why is we'd adopted extreme programming. And by about 2003, we realized it didn't work everywhere. But now we could start to map the environments. We learned that agile development, as in extreme programming, test-driven development, etc., was very strong on the left-hand side because it was about reducing the cost of change. But it was weak on the right-hand side compared to things like Six Sigma. And both of them were weak in the middle. Eventually we got lean. So now we've got product owners, we've got more KPIs, we're including things like Kanban, etc., Scrum. So what we learned was no such thing as one-size-fits-all methods. Doesn't exist. You've got polar opposites and a transition in the middle. The next pattern we learned is as things evolve, like electricity, they enable higher order systems. So electricity-enabled lighting, computing, radio, television, etc. So it expands the adjacent possible. And that's known as componentization, Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy. The next pattern we learnt was that those higher order systems were new sources of value and worth. And as they evolved, they enabled higher order systems, which evolved, enabled higher order systems. So what you get is a line of the present, constantly moving and expanding. The next pattern we learnt is we didn't have choice. This is known as the Red Queen effect, Professor Clayton McVeigh. So if you are competing against others and one adapts and they gain those benefits of efficiency, speed and new sources of value and worth, they create pressure on you to change. As more adapt, that pressure mounts until you have no choice. That's why things like cloud computing, you had no choice. It wasn't a question of if, it's a question of when. The next pattern you learn, climatic, is that we have inertia to change, created by past success. So, for example, Blockbuster, Netflix. Who was first with a website? Blockbuster, great. Who was first with video ordering online? Blockbuster, great. Who was first with experimenting with video streaming? Blockbuster, great. Who went bankrupt first? Right? They out-innovated the market, and yet they went bankrupt. Why did they go bankrupt? What was the inertia caused by? Stores. Right. It was a particular thing. It was late fees. Do you remember late? Right. Who remembers video cassette recorders? And the answer to this gets narrower every single year, or smaller every year. Do you remember video cassette recorders? Great. You remember you forgot to take them back? And you had to pay late fees? That was a core part of their business model. That's what created inertia. Now, there are 31 common economic patterns, climatic patterns, and you can use those for anticipation. So that's what we did back in 2005. We had our value chain. We knew a number of those patterns. We knew that compute and platform would evolve to a utility. We knew we'd have inertia to the change, and that it would enable higher order systems to appear. And the point about that, it gave us multiple points that we could attack. We could build in any of these spaces. Now, the next set of patterns you learn are known as doctrine. So these are universally useful patterns. You could decide not to implement them, but they are universally useful. Climatic patterns will happen to you regardless of what you choose. Things will evolve. Now, the first doctrine that you learn of these universally applicable principles is all about user needs. So emergency services mobile communication platform, it's the critical infrastructure, radios, police, ambulance, and so forth. Big specification document. First time sitting down with people saying, right, what's the user need? Everybody goes, oh, it's somewhere in the document, nobody actually knows. So a group of them mapped the entire thing. It only took a few hours. One of the things about mapping is it forces you, because the anchor is user need, to think about what the users actually need. Now, there can be multiple users, often competing. So you can have public consumers, regulators, even the business, often in competition. So the first thing you learn is to focus on user needs, but that's not enough. You need to know the details as well. So that's the second thing you learn. You need to understand the components that make that user need. So you need to think small. Now, one of the beauties about maps, because they're useful for collaboration and sharing, is if you take maps from different groups like borders, police and immigration and share them, you start to discover we've got common components, and we often rebuild the same thing. So maps are quite useful for taking out bias and duplication. Now, I used to think government was bad. The worst example of duplication in government that I've ever found is 118 workflow systems doing the same thing, registering prisoners into prisons. We've built it 118 times. In the commercial world excels. When it comes to waste, duplication, and getting stuff wrong, the private sector is amazing. So the worst example I've got so far is a bank that has 1,000 risk management systems all doing the same thing. They complain they can't innovate, but they've gone and rebuilt risk management over 1,000 times. Now, assuming you remove duplication from your maps, the next thing you need to learn is called FIST, Fast and Expensive, Simple and Tiny, US Air Force. It's the process of breaking things down into small components. So it was used for the Harvest Hawk. It's a marine combat aircraft. This went from paper to combat operations in 18 months, fired its first shot in 19 months. So it's pretty simple. You take your map and you break down into small contracts. The smaller, the better. Microservices, even better. Now you start to apply methods. And what you do is you're using Agile as in extreme programming, test-driven development on the left, more lean or buying off-the-shelf products if available in the middle, and then you're using more outsourcing, or if you're building Six Sigma on the right-hand side. You're using multiple methods at the same time. Okay? Now, unfortunately, the actual contract structure looked like this because no one had mapped it beforehand. And this is a problem, this big red bit in the middle, because there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all method. So to give you an example, do you know what a world perception server is? Anybody? It's part of a self-driving car. Right, anybody from finance here? No? Right, I'm going to pretend you're all from finance, which basically means all IT is Elvish to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a systems diagram and I've translated it into Elvish. Okay? So you're now feeling like you're the CFO looking at this IT diagram. And I'm going to ask you a question. Should we outsource or build our own? Should we outsource or build our own? What do you think about A? Do you think we should outsource or build our own? You have no idea, do you? This is the sort of standard of conversation we have in organizations. I'm going to turn this into a map. I'm going to ask that question again. Should we outsource or build our own? A. Outsource. Right? Should we outsource or build our own? It's the same diagram, but it's now in a mapping format. If you convert it back to English, GPS, World Perception Server. Pretty straightforward. Now, most organizations have no maps, which means they don't learn climatic patterns or principles or doctrine. And so what they tend to do is apply one-size-fits-all methods. And they tend to yo-yo. So they go, oh, Six Sigma worked over here, we better do Six Sigma everywhere. And then, oh, Agile worked over here, we better use Agile everywhere. And then Six Sigma, so they tend to yo-yo. Or they outsource the whole lot. And so the bits which are industrialized get treated well, but they can't see that. And they always get messed up by the uncharted space, because this stuff changes, which means you can't specify it in detail in a contract specification. So they always get hammered by excessive change control costs, and they repeat the same mistakes over and over. And invariably, when the fight happens with the vendor, somebody goes, well, next time we need to specify it better. It's gibberish. You can't. You need to break things down into the components. So let us assume you use appropriate methods. The next thing you do is think about small teams, as in cell-based structures, autonomous teams you control through the interfaces, what we call a fitness function. Then you discover you've got different attitudes. There's no such thing as one-size-fits-all culture. So what we have is pioneers, settlers, town planners. People who are brilliant at building and operating in this space, as in creating the novel but highly flaky. People who are brilliant at building and operating in this space, i.e. turning that sort of nonsense into something which people really want. And then people who are brilliant at building and operating in this space, i.e. turning that product into those empires of scale. Different methods, different cultures, different attitudes. And then you can design a system of constant theft, so you create an adaptive organization. Pretty straightforward. You start off with the user needs, think small as in know the details, You remove duplication, think small as in the contracts, use appropriate methods, think small as in cells, then you think about aptitude and attitude, then you introduce a system of theft and design for constant evolution. And that was cutting edge in 2005. Okay? That's about 8 pieces of doctrine. There are about 40 basic principles. Now, if you want to know more, GCHQ, which is our intelligence services, has very kindly open-sourced Boiling Frogs, wonderful document, which talks about constant adaptation to change. Well worth reading. So, you've got a purpose, you start understanding your landscape, you start using climatic patterns to anticipate change, then you get into doctrine, how you structure and organize yourself. Finally, you get into the leadership bit. Context-specific forms of gameplay. So you've got a map, you know things are evolving, you can anticipate this, you know we're going to have inertia, we can anticipate this, we can use this to identify multiple points of attack. Can you now manipulate the market? And it turns out there's at least 70 methods of doing so. So open source, open data, open APIs, fabulously powerful play for getting things to industrialize. If you've got people with inertia, you can use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to slow things down. There's all sorts of techniques around constraints as well. The point about this is once you learn those, you come up with context-specific forms of gameplay. So that's what we did in 2005. We decided to attack the platform space. We built the world's first ever serverless environment. You build entire applications in JavaScript, front and back end, with functional billing. So billing right down to the function. No concept of servers or anything along those lines. It was very simple play. Open source effort to create a market. We're going to build an ecosystem around that, a particular model known as ILC. Other people would build on top. We'd have inertia, hence the open play. So the next thing you do is act. And you iterate around the cycle and you get better. So anyway, that's what we did. We launched the world's first ever serverless environment in 2005. It grew like hotcakes. It was fantastic. The speed of development was truly amazing. Unfortunately, the parent company got a big bunch of American consultants come in and say the 3 things that we were doing, cloud, Amazon shortly launched afterwards, 3D printing and the use of mobile phones as cameras, were not the future. The future was, in fact, 3D television. So we should shut it all down and spend $1 billion on 3D TV. Who's got a 3D TV here? Who uses it? Right. So then I decided to quit. I went to Ubuntu. Anybody heard of Ubuntu? Right. So we mapped out the environment, used the maps to determine where to attack. We started off at around about 2%, 3% of the operating system market, up against Microsoft and Red Hat. 18 months later, it cost me $500,000. We took 70% of all cloud computing. Does anybody remember those days? Ubuntu wasn't really anywhere, and then about a year and a bit later, Ubuntu was everywhere. Does anybody remember that? Yeah? Okay. We did our job. And then I wrote something called the Better for Less paper, which helped transform UK government in terms of spend control and also the introduction of something called GDS, Government Digital Services. So this was back in 2010. And so even today, friends of mine like Liam Maxwell tweet about how they've just, by simply mapping and understanding a problem, they've saved 420 million in one service. Most of the stuff that I do now is nation-state competition. So looking at how different nations manipulate markets, how we can counter-manipulate. But in terms of mapping, and all this stuff is Creative Commons, by the way, I've had friends write science fiction books using mapping. This is how bizarre it has got. The Punch of Scrow, written by Tal Klein, it's actually been bought for about 6 figures, it's being turned into a major film now. So quite exciting. Anyway, most people at this point go, oh, this is complex. And the reality is, it's not really. There is a problem, however. We laugh at about using a magic framework like a SWOT for a battle, but we do this in business because this is familiar with us. It's like the Vikings. The Vikings weren't daft to use stories. They used stories because that's what they were familiar with. They were not familiar with the fact that you could map an environment. So quick summary. If you are in my position, as I was back then, 12, 13 years ago, feeling like, oh my, I don't know what I'm doing, it's pretty straightforward. There is a cycle to strategy. Obviously, it's important to act. Action is the process of movement, it is the process of learning, but it's also really useful to understand the landscape you're competing in. And of course, take small steps as you go around, you get better at the game, and this is what is meant by crossing the river by feeling the stones. It's all about having a direction, taking action, small steps, but also understanding and learning from the landscape as you go. Now, all of this stuff, as I said, is Creative Commons. You can help yourself. At this point, I'm going to say thank you. Can we just... So you've got... Hang on, before we do that, can we just pop back to the slides just for a second?
There we go.
Okay, so I said there was a magical mystery tour. As in we're exceeding the safe level of slides now. So there's a whole bunch of subjects which we could talk about. Serverless and why you've got no choice over it, and how Amazon is going to dominate the world. Ecosystem plays as in very specific model, not the sort of hand-wavy. Flow, why actually getting rid of bottlenecks can lead to the death of your business. Competitor analysis, fool's mate, evolution, weak signals, all the way down to Brexit. So we've got a number of topics that we can quickly cover, well, partially, or we can do questions. Your choices. Do you want to know why serverless is going to change your world?
What? Yeah. Why don't we do a little bit on that?
And then
we'll take just one or two questions.
Well, I've got plenty of time until the taxi gets here. So serverless, right, compute. Do you remember when compute was a product, as in servers? Right, we built applications using novel emerging practice based upon the idea of compute as a product or server. And so what that means is the servers had a high MTTR, high mean time to recovery. So when your server went bang, it would take you weeks to get a new one. So we built emerging architectural practices like scale up, capacity planning, M+1. Anybody remember M+1? Anyone? Yes, a few. Great. Disaster recovery test. Anybody remember disaster recovery test? Yes, right. Fantastic. And they evolved and became best practice for that world. And then what happened is compute evolved to a utility. And so we had a new set of emerging architectural practices based upon the characteristics of compute as a utility. So it's now a low MTTR. Of course, we gave it a dreadful name because we don't like having sensible names. We called this stuff cloud. And these new emerging architectural practices were not scale up, but scale out, distributed systems designed for failure, chaos engines, or chaos monkey, as Netflix calls them, and more continuous deployment. Anyway, over time, we gave that a name. We called it DevOps. We had a new tribe built around that. And this is a simple pattern. It's known as coevolution. Happened in the mechanical age, financial age. It's very common. Now, the problem with it is applications built with best architectural practice for a product world is legacy. Applications built with good emerging to best on a cloud world is the new world, and that's called DevOps. And what would happen is CEOs would run around saying, make my legacy cloudy, because they want those benefits of speed, efficiency, new sources of value or worth. And so people would stick the legacy based upon a high MTTR environment into a low MTTR environment. Amazon would have an outage, and they'd run around screaming, the end of cloud is nigh. To which you would go, shouldn't that architecture evolve as well? And they'd normally go, burn him, heretic, all that sort of stuff, okay? And that's because they've got inertia to this change. And then vendors would exploit that. They would come in and say, what you need is the enterprisey cloud. So roll in the enterprisey cloud. All the benefits of volume operations, using commodity components, but built with customized, non-commodity hardware customized to my needs. Aye, laddie, but you cannot change the laws of physics. I mean, commodity does not equal non-commodity. You know, volume operations does not mean customizations. But it didn't stop companies spending billions, literally billions, on no-hope efforts. In fact, I had a conversation with one particular company, and they were going to spend $1 billion on their private cloud. I said I could give them the same result for 20 million. And I said, how? I said, well, you pay me 20 million, I will sit on a beach for 5 years drinking margaritas, and then I will phone you up and say, we failed. Unfortunately, well, I got a phone call not so long ago. It was basically, we wish we'd paid you 20 million. Anyway, this coevolution is now happening at the platform layer. So we used to have applications built with best coding practice for a platform stack which was product-based, so things like LAMP or .NET or whatever. And now we are moving to a much more code execution environment or utility environment. Again, we've given it a lousy name because we can't call it platform as a service because a whole bunch of people have just described utter gibberish as platform as a service. So we have to call it something useless like serverless, despite the fact that underneath it, there obviously is servers. And what we're getting is a coevolution of practice. So we've got this emerging architectural practice building, but we don't even have a meme for it yet. So we've just called it Jeff in the hope that someone will come up with a more sensible name. And so that's where you should be investing. That's where the future is. So that's why things like Lambda are so important. And of course, all the stuff underneath it and the old coding architectural practices is legacy, I'm afraid. The problem with that is you've got DevOps in that space. And of course, when you go around telling people DevOps is the new legacy, they all go, burn him heretic. Okay, but DevOps was great 2010, 2011. It's not 2010, 2011 now, it's 2017. You start a DevOps program now, 5 to 7 years when you're up and running, you'll find the entire world has shifted to a whole bunch of new practices built on things like Lambda. Ecosystems. I can do ecosystems or questions, whatever you want. I keep going until the taxi gets here. I'm going to get to Estonia.
You want to do? Yeah, let's do ecosystems. And we'll skip the questions.
All right. Do you own a pet? A cat? I can't stand cats. That's why I use them in presentations.
Let's go back to the slides, please.
Come back swotless or on your shields. That's quite funny. Well, of course, the thing about maps is people. I teach all these companies in. Lots of governments, lots of very big companies in the US. You can guess who some. Well, actually, a couple of weeks ago, an executive from Amazon was actually showing their map of the machine learning space and their gameplay of how they're going to own it, which is like somebody playing chess and saying to you, here's my next 3 moves, it's going to be checkmate, and there's nothing you can do about it. Frightening stuff. Anyway, so ecosystems. If you take a pre-existing product and shift it to a utility, so you commoditize a component, and expose it through an API, then other people can build on top. Those other people are your free research and development department. Because what you do is you mine the metadata, not their data, but the metadata, to see what's popular. So if I build something like, I don't know, compute as a utility, and you're all building, I don't know, rubbish, kit and internet, and you're building something useful, which is growing, I get the metadata because I can see the consumption rates of the services. So I then commoditize to new component services, and you grumble, I've eaten your business model, and then other people build on top. It's a very old model. This is 12 years old, this one, 2005. So what you do is you get others to basically build new things for you. That's the innovate bit. You mine the metadata, so you leverage the entire ecosystem as a future sensing engine to spot future patterns, and then you commoditize to new component services. And it's really simple because what happens is your apparent rate of innovation, despite the fact you're not doing any, now increases with the size of the ecosystem, i.e. people built on top, your customer focus increases with the size of the ecosystem, and your efficiency, simply from economies of scale, increase with the size of the ecosystem. It's a very specific model known as ILC. It's very powerful. If you really want to do it, the best way is to kill off innovation in your organization, and the best way I know to do that, so you force everybody just to take pre-existing acts and industrialize. The best way I know to do that is to use something called the press release process. So the press release process is very simple. Before you do anything, you have to write the press release. And you can't write a press release for the novel and new. You can only take pre-existing acts and industrialize them. So you force the company in that direction. Anyway, so if I look at serverless, Amazon, I know they've been mining metadata, have done a brilliant job of chewing up the entire space here. They're almost certainly going to do the same in the serverless space. I mean, you can spot people using this play, because if they appear to be more innovative every year, more efficient every year, more customer-focused every year, and occasionally people grumble they've eaten my business model, you know that's the harvesting bit. They're playing that game. And you can't compete unless you've got a bigger ecosystem with somebody like Alibaba. I presume you all know that stuff, yes? Yeah, that's pretty basic. Flow. Do you want to know about flow? Yeah? Okay. It's a cup of tea. One of the things about a value chain is that you have flows in it. Flows of financial capital, all sorts of different types of capital flows, knowledge capital, risk. And so what you can do is, as a user, that you have a financial flow in terms of you want the cup of tea normally, and there's a physical flow to you of the tea. Normally, if you say map something like a tea shop, you've got a business up there at the top as well. And so some of that financial flow is going to the business, and you often have a conflict in terms of cost and profit. Anyway, you can start putting metrics to this. So you use these for building business models. So I've done this for a cup of tea. I've just put some metrics there. Can you see anything obviously wrong with the diagram other than the fact that it's missing a mug? Right, I'll do it as a map. Can you see anything obviously wrong with the diagram? Why is kettle custom built? Yes. And so you go, well, why are we custom building kettles? Surely it should be more of a commodity. Of course, you'll get inertia because somebody's job will be making the custom-built kettle, and they will be like, oh no, our kettle is somehow magically boils water better than anybody else's, but it has a financial impact. Okay. So let me jump to insurance company then. So, insurance company had a problem. This is its process flow. It needs compute. It was ordering servers, went into goods in, it was modifying, mounting them, and that's how it got new compute. And it had a bottleneck. And it had a bottleneck around the modification and mounting of these servers into its data center. So what it did, it decided it was going to get rid of that bottleneck, improve the flow by automating with robotics. And they put a business case together, and it was about $2 million, return on investment in under 1 year. And so they're about to spend $2 million, building robotics. Sound sensible? No one wants to answer that. All right, so I got them to map. It took about 10 minutes. User needs compute, compute needs order server, it also needs racking, mounting, modification. 2 flows in here. Anybody see anything obviously wrong with this diagram? Have a look at racks. Why is racking custom built? So, turns out this insurance company had custom built racks. It had a company which actually built its racks for them. And the reason why they had to do the modification, do you want to guess? Standard servers didn't fit into its custom-built racks. So what they had to do was take the cases off standard servers, drill new holes, add new plates, in order to put them into their custom-built racks. So they were going to spend money on robotics to automate that process, because that was the bottleneck. Can anybody think of an alternative? Use standard racks. Yeah, custom-built servers. Yeah. Yeah, standard racks. Okay? And that gets rid of this. And then, of course, you have the question, you're an insurance company. Why have you got compute anyway? Why do we have a data center? I mean, we can actually just use utility services and get rid of all of this nonsense. Now, does it make sense to invest in robotics in order to increase process flow and get rid of the bottleneck? No. Now, this is one of the most common things that I see, is people spending vast sums of money making highly ineffective processes more efficient. Okay? So the duplication is bad enough, as in let's build the same thing 1,000 times because we haven't got a way of communicating the fact that we built the same thing 1,000 times. The bias is bad, as in let's custom build what is already a commodity. That's bad. The misapplication of methods is bad. Let's try and use, Six Sigma where it's not appropriate, or try and specify the uncertain in detail. That's bad because we get hammered by change control costs. The next one in that list is let's spend vast sums of money optimizing flow, as in making highly ineffective systems more efficient. Okay? We can do questions if you want, or competitor analysis. I'm not going to get to Brexit.
Yeah,
because I've got to get on a plane.
Let's end there, and let's take one or two questions, and then we'll wrap up. And I think people want to know more. So what was the URL for generating the strategy?
Well, all of this stuff is creative. If you just search for my name, you'll find sites. I will send you the slides so you circulate them. You'll find I've got a 600-page book I'm still writing on medium.com. It's all Creative Commons. Help yourself. I mean, I've built 4 companies and sold them all. I do lots of stuff with government. I do lots of interesting stuff. Most of my stuff is nation state. I made this all Creative Commons long ago, so please help yourself. Right.
All right.
Can we move on
and eventually all the slides from all the presentations will be on the Stretch website. So.
How would you convince the Persians that their motto should be come back swotless or on your shield? Any tips for... Right. So one thing about maps, all maps are imperfect. Okay? All maps. So if you look at a geographical map, of France, in order for it to be a perfect representation of France, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which basically means it would have to be France. All right, and that's useless. Well, not France. Well, that's a matter of debate, isn't it? But anyway, so it would have to be 1-to-1 scale. Okay, so all maps are imperfect representation. Now, the method of mapping that I used to think everybody else in the world, because I was the imposter CEO, was obviously mapping. It took me 7 years to realize that other people didn't. I teach at 3 business schools now, voluntary sort of stuff. All models are wrong, okay? Someone will make a better way of mapping. So don't waste, you start from the point of view of think about users, understand the components, think about how evolved they are. That's enough to start. So could we move on with your other topics?
I'm afraid we can't because
I've got to get a taxi.
Yes. So we'll say thank you.
Pleasure.
We've got a little gift for you with your character on it.
Oh, wow. That is
so
fantastic.
You can take it home.
Thank you.